Ask Dan Schneider. On this Ask Dan Schneider, I will be answering a question that was sent to me by a man named Bobby F. He had submitted some poems, and sorry, Bobby, but they were not good. But along with his submission that I did delete, he had asked me who I thought was the best poet ever. Well, that's an interesting kind of question because does it mean the best poet ever? That best poet, for example, I might never have read. His or her poems might be sitting in an attic closet someplace. Of course, if I'm being honest, I would say I am the best poet that I've ever read. And the reason is because of all the published poets that I know, the best published poet, the poet with the most amount of great published poems would be Rainer Maria Rilke with about 70, 71. All but 4 or 5 of them written in German, the other 4 or 5 written in French. And that's something even I can't do. But in all honesty, when I stopped writing poems about a decade ago, after about a dozen years after becoming a great poet, I had, I think, 1,021 poems that I considered great of my own. Quality, quantity, diversity, these are the three things. The great quality, a great quantity of poems, and diversity that shows that writing greatly, poetry or anything else is not a fluke. 1,021 versus 71, that's 950 more than Rilke ever wrote, and Rilke had probably written the most. But I was being extra harsh on myself too. I didn't count a few hundred haiku that I wrote, which if a third to half of them could be considered great poems, there's another 200 there. And since I always was the harshest on myself, I could probably add anywhere from another 150 to 300 poems. So I probably have anywhere from arguably 1,200 to 1,600 great poems if I was to total them, which is, 20 plus times as great as Rilke. This is a multiples greater, even greater than the difference that, say, Babe Ruth, when he became a famous home run hitter in the early 20th century in professional baseball, when he shattered records, he was only 3, 4, 5 times as many home runs. Anyway, if I discount myself and I discount Rilke as the greatest published poet, there are other published poets like Wallace Stevens and Walt Whitman, who might have between 40 and 60 great poems. There are other foreign language poets that I'd have to rely on translations. Hart Crane, Robinson Jeffers. Crane had 20 plus great poems, plus the bridge. Robinson Jeffers had a few book-length poems that could be considered great, even some verse drama, and 3, maybe 4 dozen great poems, arguably. Pablo Neruda wrote dozens of great, 3 or 4 dozen great love poems, but his rest of his poetry sucked. If I'm going about people that I knew, my wife Jess had written, probably anywhere between 30 and 40 great poems. She hasn't written poetry for almost as long as I have not, and that's because we both moved on to writing prose, and it's not because prose is harder, but I know one of the things I had difficulty with towards the last couple of years of writing poetry was I was becoming too godlike. It was less of a challenge. And I know that sounds arrogant, but it's true. So I moved on to prose, and it took me a few years to get up to speed where now I can do anything in prose. So my wife Jessica could be a candidate if I exclude myself. Another couple of people from the Uptown Poetry Group that I'd have to mention, Bruce Ario, who can write doggerel, but also then wrote as far as I know, maybe at least 12 to 15 great poems in the Ario format. And given the years that he wrote before and after I knew him and was living in the Twin Cities, I'd have to say he probably had maybe 30 or so great Arios, and that he developed a poem form would give him a claim to being a great poet and one of the best out there, along with a Sylvia Plath, who'd have probably a similar amount of great poems. Don Moss wrote probably a dozen great poems that they were all subsumed into a great long poem called Dominions, which is, after the bridge, I would say the best long poem written in the English language by an American of the last century. So Don Moss would have to get a mention. But if I was to think of the person that I knew personally, other than myself or my wife, I would go with a fellow named Greg Clark that I first met at a poetry group called the Garden Crow Poetry Group. I knew him throughout the 90s. The last I saw him was the first time Jessica met him at a restaurant, and this was maybe 99, 2000. And I haven't seen him since. I know he probably wrote 12, 15 to maybe 20 great poems that I had seen, arguably in that range, in poems that I saw at the Uptown Poetry Group, that he came once or twice at the Garden Crow Poetry Group, and also a dozen or so times that we got together to exchange poems and ideas on poems. Anyway, I have lost touch with Greg Clark, so if Greg Clark is out there and he's listening, Greg, give me a call. Contact me at Cosmoetica and let me know. Show me some of your poems. I'd love to put some of your poems online. Greg Clark is one of the MIA poets, the missing in action poets that I have a page for. Anyway, that's my opinion on who the greatest poet that I've known is. If we're talking overall number of poems, quality, quantity, diversity, it's me by a long shot. If we're talking published poet, it's probably Rainer Maria Rilke, or one could argue a Wallace Stevens, a Robinson Jeffers, or Walt Whitman. If it's personally who I knew, it's probably a Greg Clark or my wife Jessica, or perhaps Bruce Ario or Don Moss. So that's a long answer to a short question, so I thank the man who sent it. Again, sorry that I couldn't post your poems. They simply were not great at all and nowhere close. This is Dan Schneider.